Okay. All right. Well, hello, everybody. Um, so I have this long-standing interest in what I call human interdependence. People cooperate and compete. I say they do it at three levels, kind of as individuals. As an individual, I try to cooperate with other people. I try to compete with other people. Uh, and then we also form coalitions, and the coalitions uh, cooperate uh, with other coalitions and compete with other coalitions. And I kind of put a dividing line between coalitions at the below the Dunbar number level and coalitions above the Dunbar level, because I think there's a lot of uh, a lot of difference between the way we cooperate and compete in at those two levels. So I think of that's sort of there being three levels. Um, and I think it's fair to say Dan has an overlapping interest in that whole issue of human cooperation competition. And very related to that is what I call social epistemology. Now, epistemology in philosophy is the study of how we determine what's true. And if you look at that in practice, where almost everything we think about or believe, we picked up from other people. Um, that's something that anthropologists are very clear on. They'll say, well, this tribe believes this tribe believes that. And Joseph Henrich has famously argued that's kind of a defining quality of humans is the way we pick up this cultural knowledge. And the and yet, I took a course in college way back when in modern European philosophy. It's not, I wasn't quite in I'm not that old that these were not contemporaries of mine, but you study Locke and Hume and Descartes and uh, Kant and so on. And none of those philosophers who you uh, study said a thing about what I would call social epistemology. It's almost as if your epistemology is you're wandering in the forest, deciding what's edible and what's not, and you just figure out for yourself what's edible and what's not. When in fact, we learn these things by copying, by reading, and so on. So that's by way of introduction, why I find this stuff interesting. Um, and Dan, you want to just give a little of your background and what you're up to and so on? And I'm excited that you have a new Substack.
Hi, yeah. So the Substack is called Conspicuous Cognition. So I'm a philosopher. I'm a lecturer at the University of Sussex, and I guess my overarching research interest falls within social epistemology, very broadly construed. Although really it's a sort of intersection of social epistemology, psychology, evolutionary theory, and sociology. So I'm interested in why people believe what they believe. I'm also interested in what it even really means to believe something. Um, and I'm especially interested in those cases where people seem to believe things which are sort of not well supported by their available evidence. You can think of lots of cases like that when it comes to political ideologies and political belief systems more broadly. You might include many kinds of sort of supernatural religious belief systems in that category. You can think of individual level self-deception and various things like that. And the kind of overarching claim within the way in which I approach these things is that many phenomena that sort of seem superficially irrational or biased or unreasonable or strange when you look at human belief and human cognition and so on, actually there's often a kind of underlying hidden social rationality behind those beliefs and behind those forms of reasoning. And so a lot of my research is trying to spell that basic idea out and then apply it in different kinds of contexts like politics, collective delusions, certain kinds of supernatural and religious belief systems, and so on.
So we think, when we look back, and we look at primitive people, we think that they had all these irrational beliefs, and we've somehow come up with ways to be more rational. Is that a fair statement?
Do you mean that's how we see it, or do you mean that's actually an accurate representation of how things are?
Answer those in turn.
I think many people see things that way. And I think it's definitely true that, what we've got in the modern West and to some significant degree in other parts of the world as well are certain kinds of institutions like science and public health authorities when they're working well, which is definitely not always, to put it mildly. And these, you typically don't have in hunter-gatherer groups, and you don't have really prior to the Enlightenment. And I definitely think these sorts of institutions are incredibly important for taking biased, status-seeking, often individually, seemingly unreasonable individuals and churning out collective knowledge. So we've got physics and astronomy and so on. But I think in terms of the sort of differences in individual level cognition, there's not a massive variation. And I also think often when we look at, say, hunter-gatherer tribes, lots of what they believe seems like it's very irrational or unreasonable, or relies on sort of magical thinking, but actually has this underlying social rationality to it. So the anthropologist Manveer Singh has this fantastic example where he studied the Mentawai people in Indonesia. And they've got a belief in this spirit that hunts people down if they don't share their meat with fellow members of the clan, right? So superficially, that seems like it's a pretty irrational belief, because I don't think there is any such spirit that hunts people down if they don't share their meat. But actually, if you think about human beings as facing this really difficult problem of cooperation and aligning incentives in such a way that you overcome individual selfishness and you share with others in the group, that kind of belief, which is kind of irrational from an epistemological point of view, can serve this sort of social function. It can signal that you are cooperative if you endorse that kind of belief. And also you can be motivated to sort of try and persuade other people in the community of that belief, precisely because you want them to share their meat with people in the group. So I think lots of things which look like they're magical thinking or irrational often have this kind of underlying social function.
So a couple of directions I wanted to go with that. So first of all, are you familiar with Jonathan Rauch's book, The Constitution of Knowledge?
Yeah, great book.
So that seems to summarize this notion that it isn't really at the individual level that we arrive at rationality. We all walk in with our basic biases, especially I would say especially reluctant to let go of things that we believe, and eager to discount or dispute beliefs that are different from ours. But somehow, if you set up the institutions right, the overall result is more rationality. Is that kind of consistent with your model of the world, that our individual biases get kind of that the individual biases kind of get washed out or filtered at using these institutions like scientific inquiry and marketplace of ideas and so on?
Yeah, I'm very, very sympathetic to the sorts of things that he argues for in that book. And I think it's not, and he points this out, it's not just a peculiarity of the epistemic domain that's true. I mean, you find that across all sorts of areas of human social behavior, like markets and capitalism. They have similar sorts of functions of taking biased, self-interested individuals, not totally self-interested, but somewhat biased in that direction, and aligning incentives in such a way that you get collective benefits. And I think that's true in the epistemic domain as well. It's been a while now since I've read the Rauch book. I think that he might overstate the degree of sort of individual level irrationality. So I think human beings have two different kinds of goals when it comes to forming beliefs. On the one hand, our goal can be to form accurate beliefs and to sort of understand how things are. And I think when that's our goal, we tend to be pretty rational, like not perfectly rational as individuals, but like pretty good. And I think the kind of Danny Kahneman idea that we're just riddled with all of these cognitive biases and so on is a little bit overstated. And I think also when it comes to social learning, when our goal is to get at the truth, we tend to be pretty like vigilant and sophisticated social learners. But we've also got this other set of goals, which are not to do with getting at the truth, but to do with things like persuasion and reputation management and in-group signaling and that kind of thing. And I think there, again, in some sense, we often are quite individually rational. It's just that we're not using our reasoning, we're not using our cognition to get at the truth. We've got other kinds of functions. So my sense from reading that book was he somewhat overstates the degree to which individuals are completely riddled with cognitive biases. I would say we're motivationally biased to reach certain kinds of conclusions. So we're often overconfident and so on in that respect. But when our aim is to get at the truth, I think we do tend to be like pretty rational, not perfectly rational, but more rational than the kind of Kahneman behavioral economics story I think would often suggest.
Okay, just a second. We had a request for you to maybe spell the name of the person who you referred to the meat demon.
That's Manveer Singh. I'll put that in the chat.
Okay, great. Okay, so one way I would approach that issue of individuals being rational on the one hand and not on the other is that basically everything we get from other people. And so when so there might be some circumstances, and you call it, when we're seeking truth or whatever, where we're really trying to sort out who's telling us the truth. That would be my notion of trying to be rational and be saying, all right, you know, John A says one thing, Randy F says another. Who should I believe, and try to solve that problem. But the other sort of what you would call being irrational is sort of John A or Randy F, who do I want to affiliate with? What do you think of that kind of as a way of differentiating? Because I think it's all a matter of taking in input from other people. It's not like, there's this, rational person who's just, trying to solve the laws of physics himself, and an irrational person who's, making things up.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. So I think, and that's really important when you think about social epistemology. So like there are some cases where our goal is to form true beliefs, to figure out how things are. And so we need to figure out who we should trust, who we should tune into, who we should try to get information from if we're to achieve that goal. And that's really complicated and interesting for all sorts of reasons, but that's one kind of project. And then there's another kind of project where it's not so much that we're trying to get at the truth and we're relying on other people to figure out what the truth is. It's that we're trying to achieve social goals. So you mentioned affiliation. The way I think about it in my work is there are sort of two basic social goals that can end up biasing how we form beliefs. So on the one hand, there is sort of persuasion and propaganda. I think people are motivated to spread or disseminate certain kinds of beliefs or narratives. And we tend to, for various reasons, end up believing our propaganda. So people tend to be quite self-justifying, self-aggrandizing, self-serving in the kinds of beliefs that they form. And you also find that at the group level. So when you identify with a political party or some kind of cultural faction, we tend to, in effect, function as sort of propagandists for our political or cultural team. That's too deterministic for various reasons. So it's more complicated than that, but that's one kind of bias. And then another way in which I think social goals can influence what we believe is more to do with affiliation, as you put it, which is cases in which we form beliefs sort of to signal that we're a good, loyal member of a particular community, or that we're loyal to a particular individual that we're in a relationship with. And, in both of these cases, whether we're functioning as sort of intuitive propagandists, intuitive press secretaries, or we're functioning as individuals attempting to sort of signal our loyalties and our socially attractive traits, that's social epistemology in a sense, but our goal really isn't to get at the truth. We've got these other kind of strategic social goals. Does that map onto how you see things, or is
I
that
think so. The signaling goal, I mean, historically, okay, this is kind of a random question, but does the signaling goal require an irrational belief? Like if I tell you that the sun rises in the east, that can't signal anything. But if I tell you that, there's this demon who's gonna, harm you if you don't share your meat, uh, that's a better signal because it's not so obviously true. And so the less obviously true, or even the more false the belief, the better it functions as a signal. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's sometimes true. I don't think it's necessarily the case, but I think there are cases in which a community comes together. You can think of like a really tight-knit cult, for example, and they organize around a set of beliefs or a narrative or a kind of metaphysical story which strikes those outside of the community as completely absurd. And the fact that it strikes those outside of the community as absurd is kind of a feature, not a bug. The very fact that people outside of the community think the belief is stupid or irrational is kind of what makes it an honest signal of solidarity with or loyalty to people inside the community. And I think there are other cases as well where it's not so much about like eliciting reputational damage from those outside of the community. It's just finding an identity defining worldview, and mundane rational beliefs aren't very useful for that purpose. So if you take like the belief that Paris is the capital of France, that would not be a particularly good identity defining belief because everyone believes that no matter what group they belong to. Whereas if you take the belief that, I don't know, let's say the earth is flat, stated in 2023, that might be a pretty good identity defining belief because you're only going to believe that if you belong to a particular kind of subculture, probably. But I
Well,
don't.
on
Oh, sorry.
that level, you could have just, opinions about what type of music is the best. And that wouldn't take you into the level of, believing something that's false. It would just take you to having a strong opinion that other people might not have.
I think that's right. Yeah, and of course you do find those communities who are going to united around shared music tastes and preferences. So I don't think it's necessarily that prevalent, but the philosopher Neil Van Leeuwen has a book came out this year called Religion as Make-Believe, I think it's called. And he argues there that at least certain kinds of religious beliefs should be understood in terms of performing this kind of identity defining function. That at least one of the things that's important about them and that sort of shapes the belief is precisely that it helps to sort of differentiate the community from other communities. And I think he thinks the fact that they're belief-like is important in playing that identity defining role. If it just happened to be a kind of musical preference or something, it wouldn't perform that same function.
And why wouldn't it?
Yeah, I'm not. I can't remember the exact details of the story that he tells. I mean, it might be one of those things where people are looking at the fact that you've got these communities that have somewhat strange beliefs and trying to come up with an explanation for it. It might also be that he's got the kind of diagnosis wrong, and it really is important that you incur this kind of reputational damage in the eyes of outsiders. But it's a good question, yeah. So, as I understand, your question is, surely there are easier, sort of cheaper ways of getting an identity-defining preference or something together than embracing irrational beliefs. Is that the kind of worry?
Well, or just that maybe that, there's a role that enmity plays. Like, if I like, 60s rock, and you like, hip hop, it's hard for us to hate each other over that. So maybe the beliefs that bind people the most are the ones that generate enmity and sort of a clear line of demarcation between two groups.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think also often the contents of the belief are playing an important role. So it's not just that the belief is sort of distinctive of the group, but it's the belief that, for example, you in your group are the chosen people. If you believe that your group is composed of the chosen people and you sincerely believe that, and you display your commitment to that belief, that is a kind of signal that you're likely to be selectively cooperative with members of that community. So it could be that in some cases, like the very specific content of the belief is playing an important role. And I definitely think that's true. If you take the belief that spirit is going to hunt people down if they don't share their meat, if you embrace that belief and you sort of demonstrate your commitment to that belief, you're signaling, just as you would be signaling if you believe that God is always watching, that you are in fact likely to share your meat. Because if you believe that and you sincerely believe that, then you've got a good practical reason to share your meat with sort of fellow members of the clan. So it could be that the specific content of the belief is playing an important role over and above the fact that the belief is just distinctive of the community.
So certain beliefs, the content of them helps the group survive. So just a randomly irrational belief doesn't help your group survive, but a belief that the demon will get you if you don't share your meat helps the group survive.
Yeah, and helps individuals within that group cooperate with each other, and also helps you, the believer, demonstrate to other people that you are in fact likely to share your meat, which is going to make you seem more trustworthy to members of the community. I think that would be the idea.
So a random leap, people have remarked that these days in the United States, people are inclined to believe that if the other party wins an election, the result will be a catastrophe. And sort of how does that kind of belief evolve, and why would that serve a useful purpose?
The way that I would think about that is, so as I've mentioned, in addition to these issues concerning signaling, I think we also tend to, in many contexts, behave as sort of intuitive propagandists, sort of pushing narratives that promote and justify either our own interests as individuals or the interests of the political and cultural groups that we identify with. And I think part of what that means often is pushing narratives that justify why your side, your political team, should win power and status, but also narratives that denigrate and demonize the other side, right? And it's a very effective kind of propaganda, if you can get it to stick, that the other side is this great existential threat, or the other side is this terrible threat to democracy. Of course, it can in fact be the case that some political factions and movements are a threat to democracy. But I think underneath the specifics of any given case is the fact that when we strongly identify with a group in competition with or in rivalry against another group, we're often motivated to frame reality in ways which promote and justify our group and our group's claim to power and status in competition with that other group. That's probably how I would think about that kind of case. I don't know what you think about that, but
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. Okay, I think we already have some people champing at the bit to ask some questions, so I think I will open it up a little bit. Elijah, did you still have a question?
Yeah, I had a thought building off of kind of the enmity discussion and why it is that it seems like enmity is a key part of a lot of I guess separating into different groups. How much of that do you think um, is is just because signaling negatives is so much more effective? It gets people's attention. I think it says more about you than maybe a preference for something that you like, because dislikes are maybe fewer and further between. And when you like something, you can like it for a lot of different reasons. When you dislike it, it's like there's probably easier to share the reason why you came to that belief in the first place.
Hmm.
What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a really, interesting and plausible suggestion, especially in kind of heated, polarized contexts like politics in the US right now, to some degree, when it comes to certain kinds of culture war debates in the UK. As I understand your point, it's that you send a stronger signal in terms of your commitment to and your loyalty to your team if you say, I hate the other team is terrible or whatever, than you do if you just express sort of pro attitudes towards your team. Is that the general idea?
Yeah, because you're paying a bigger cost. You're taking a risk. If you declare someone awful, you make enemies basically right away. And so that high cost is obviously it carries a risk with it, but that risk is what allows you to identify the people who are going to then join with you.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's this kind of bridge burning strategy, right? If you go out and you explicitly say, like, I hate the other side and I think they're a great threat and so on, then you've kind of burned your bridges with the other side in a real tangible way. And that does, I think, send a real clear signal. I think it's interesting to think about the kinds of contexts that are likely to encourage that strategy and the kinds of contexts that aren't. So I think in politics, you do tend to find things like that. But I think you also find very tight-knit religious communities, for example, or sects or cults in some contexts, where it doesn't really seem like there's that much focus on displaying hostility or antipathy towards outsiders. So it'd be interesting to think about what kinds of environmental conditions moderate that or select for different kinds of strategies. I'm not sure really.
Do
I
you
think
think,
the modern kind of Twitter environment is perfect for this, because everybody's just a total stranger to everybody else, and it's really hard to get any attention at all. And so if you can concentrate negativity, well enough, then you manage to raise your odds of getting attention much higher. And because it's all decentralized, you don't have kind of natural, um, kind of some of the typical ways that you would form a community around likes and preferences or religious beliefs are not available to you, or they don't yield as much attention.
Hmm. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, I would also say that religious is maybe an example where there is a lot of enmity toward other religions. I mean, I think historically there's been a lot, and even now, I think uh, you know, people who belong to a religion will, really denigrate other religions or even other sects within religions and so on. Can we have Dennis? You've had your hand up. You have a question or comment?
Sure, sure, thanks. This is all very reminiscent to me of a principle that comes out of evolutionary biology and sort of behavioral ecology, which is the handicap principle. Uh, Zahavi, who was an Israeli biologist, came up with this originally. And basically, it has to do with a signal is more valuable if it is more costly. And the peacock's tail is sort of the quintessential example of this, in the sense that it's spectacular signal, but it really handicaps the peacock's mobility in rather remarkable ways. In humans, it's the types of activities certainly that some males will engage in, daredevil activities, drinking yourself under the table, things like that, that show off your quality. So the signal being very costly, it makes it a much more valuable signal, and I think that feeds into the kind of thing that's being discussed here.
I completely agree. Yeah, I've got a paper actually called Signaling, Commitment, and Strategic Absurdities, where I try to take that kind of costly signaling logic and apply it to cases of like really outlandish, kind of absurd beliefs that sometimes unite cults and sects and so on together. And yeah, there the idea is precisely from the perspective of a cooperative community of some kind, a coalition. If you're trying to discriminate between those individuals who are sort of strongly committed to and loyal to the group and those who aren't, one way in which individuals can honestly signal that commitment is precisely by acting in a way that incurs a really significant cost. And I think, as to the conversation we were just having, bridge burning, I think, can often perform that kind of function. So if you come out and you say something really extreme or outlandish, and that elicits lots of anger and hatred and outrage from individuals outside of the group, I think that can function as a kind of credible signal of allegiance to those inside of the group, if that was the kind of thing that you were getting at.
Yeah,
Right.
but I think
You
I've
could certainly
noticed,
say adult circumcision would certainly fall into that.
yeah, but you don't even have to go to something like that. It's like, when George W. Bush used to say nuclear, and that would drive his enemies mad, and just, a lot of his statements would just drive his enemies mad, which would then make his allies more loyal. And Donald Trump seems to function that way a lot. He seems to really enjoy kind of trolling the left. And then when the left reacts, and then that just, brings greater loyalty from his allies. Okay, John A., you had a question.
I guess I'd like to ask if there isn't room for signaling and attempts to join in groups that are not tied to conflict, and where you don't have, you're not burning bridges in such a striking way. So sort of a little bit more moderate version of this. It seems to be a lot of the stuff of life. So it's one thing for someone who wants to earn membership in a gang to get a tattoo on his forehead. That burns a lot of bridges in the labor market. But it's another thing, say, let's take religion, and let's just postulate that a lot of people have anxiety about the afterlife or the meaning of life or the meaning of suffering, perfectly natural things to worry about. Let me take the example of the Church of Latter-day Saints. It's one of the faster growing churches, maybe the fastest. Well, if you have religious anxiety, then the fact that people tithe and make strong commitments to their church might be a piece of evidence. So I'm talking about social epistemology. It might be, one piece of evidence that this particular set of beliefs might be more likely to be true than those of the, church down the road, where it's there's nothing is demanded of you, and people don't contribute very much in terms of effort or resources when they join. If on top of that, the members then also exhibit kind of community and healthy lifestyle and prosperity, well, it all starts to add up, but it doesn't add up to burning bridges in the way of getting a tattoo on your forehead, or it doesn't add up to really sharp conflict like Twitter. So what about the middle ground that seems also rooted in signaling and natural psychology, evolutionary psychology?
Yeah. I mean, this was sort of what I was getting at with the comment that there seem to be at least some cases where you find religious communities where they're cooperating for mutual benefit. It's a trusting community, but they don't, at least obviously, seem to be involved in the denigration of and demonization of outgroups and outsiders and so on. I'm certainly not an expert on the Mormon community, but that's always the kind of sense I get. There's lots of communication of being nice and pro-social, not that much denigration of outsiders. That might just be my own ignorance. And I definitely think that does exist, and that's really important. And you do see many of these kinds of dynamics within those communities as well. I think one thing you said, which I think is interesting, and I'm not really sure what to think about, is the idea that, you know, at least as I understood you, if people are sort of sacrificing to belong to the group, they're giving up their time, sometimes they're donating money and so on, and the group is doing very well, you might take that as evidence that the belief or the beliefs are true. Was that what you said?
If you can't check it empirically, if you can't use arguments to the best explanation of available evidence or statistical reasoning, but you want some sort of evidence that this set of beliefs might be more likely to be true about something you're anxious about than another set of beliefs. In those cases where you can't check whether the dogma is true until it's too late, with the traditional empirical method, with science, then yeah, this might be perfectly reasonable way to go about coping with religious anxiety.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to that. I think it will depend on the nature of the case and what the specific beliefs are. I mean, just very, very quickly, one thing I've also written about is the idea that, you know, often when you find these groups that organized around shared beliefs and narratives, it's often important for members of the group to think that there are reasons that the beliefs are true. And so you get a kind of project of collective self-deception in a way, where individuals behave in certain kinds of ways, they self-censor on certain kinds of topics, they demonstrate their commitment to the beliefs in certain kinds of contexts. And all of that is taken by members of the community as evidence that the relevant beliefs that they're holding are genuinely true. And that kind of eases the burden of convincing themselves of the relevant beliefs. I'm not sure if that's exactly the sort of thing that you're talking about, but I think there's definitely something to that.
I don't see any other hands up, but people are welcome to. So where does this leave sort of old-fashioned epistemology? Because I think if you want to, let's say you want to form a tribe around, we are the truth seekers. Would you then be advocating old-fashioned some form of philosophical epistemology and saying we're going to, march under that banner?
I mean, I think there are communities that do self-consciously try to do that. So I'm thinking of a community like Effective Altruists is probably a community lots of you are familiar with, or the Rationality community. And they think of themselves as being communities where they are overcoming these sort of epistemic pathologies that afflict other groups, and they're being uniquely rational. And I think I'm somewhat optimistic in some ways about those kinds of projects and somewhat pessimistic in other ways. Like every community in a way thinks of themselves as being truth-seeking and rational. So the mere fact that you think of yourself as belonging to such a community is not great evidence that you are. But I do think that human psychology is incredibly sensitive to social incentives. And so I think if you can build a community where you're socially rewarded, not for affirming your commitment to some orthodoxy or some piety, but for reasoning in ways that are rational and reasonable and unbiased, and you're punished within the community, for example, reputationally, if you're irrational or unbiased and so on. I think that really can make a difference to how individuals process information. And I also think if those communities sort of self-consciously design the norms under which they operate, that can also have some promise. So I think having kind of cognitively diverse communities, making sure that you've got really strong norms upholding free speech and open debate, making sure you don't allow for factions who go out of their way to punish any deviation from what they happen to believe and so on. If you really put a lot of effort into building in those principles of sort of good system design, I think, at least in principle, we should be quite optimistic about that sort of community. I don't know how close most real world examples of these kinds of groups come to that ideal, but I think, at least in principle, it's something to aim for. Does that address your question, or were you
Yeah, I
getting at
think
something?
so. Yeah. The next sort of a related question goes to the issue of dominance hierarchies versus prestige hierarchies, which since I become aware of that distinction, I've made a big deal of it, maybe too big a deal, but it seems to me that a prestige hierarchy is much more appealing to me and more likely to be truth-seeking than a dominance hierarchy. And one way I would describe what's gone wrong with universities is that the prestige moves are no longer respected, and people are making dominance moves instead. And in part, that may go back to these, the postmodernist view that, there is no such thing as truth, there's just power. And if you start to implement that belief, then you sort of get away from it being a prestige hierarchy and turn into a dominance hierarchy. Anyway, any reaction to that?
I think that's right, although I think, when you find, let's say, mobs that are really trying to enforce ideological orthodoxies and punish heretics and apostates and so on, they'll often depict themselves not as engaging in dominance, but as being concerned with truth and justice and so on and so forth. So I think that's a kind of complicating factor there. And I'm not sure really postmodernism is a complex tradition, and the idea that it's all about power and not about truth. I think even if you look at like the canonical postmodernist thinkers, they didn't really believe that in terms of much of what they wrote. And certainly today, if you think about prominent social justice movements, they tend to be pretty absolutist about claims concerning what's true and what's just and so on. So I'm not sure there's really any kind of underlying postmodernist motivation there. But I completely agree with you that it's a really unfortunate thing that people are introducing these kinds of dominance moves into the space of a university, where prestige is always going to play a role because it's just an ineliminable feature of the human condition. And actually, lots of what's great about science when it's working well is you channel the pursuit of prestige into the production of knowledge. So I completely agree with that side of things, that within epistemic institutions, in fact, within all of society, I would say, the more that we can try to create norms that discourage dominance play will be a good thing. But I think you're right. You're never going to get rid of prestige, and you shouldn't really, because it can be really great collective effects.
Yeah, no, I'm a big fan of it, of the prestige approach. Okay, anyone else? Okay, John A., another one. Go ahead.
On the prestige approach, I have a concern, and it goes back to, I think it goes back to Tocqueville. If there's one dimension of prestige, you're going to end up with a lot of people who feel lesser. And so what perhaps is crucial to a modern, complicated, way larger than Dunbar number society, what's crucial to a healthy civic life and social peace and happiness is that there be many dimensions of prestige, so that each person of good character has some way to shine.
Yeah. Well,
And
I think Tyler Cowen has made that point, that sort of that there need to be many different venues of prestige, and not
yeah, and
just
so
one.
but part of what's going wrong is that smart is everything, or well, pick your
Wealth is everything, whatever. Yeah.
So that's just my. It's not just prestige versus dominance hierarchies. It's that in a modern, really complicated, big society, you've got to think about how can each person become a good citizen, and how can each person have some chance to shine.
Completely agree. completely agree with that. And this is, I mean, I'd like to think a lot more about this. I don't think I fully understand exactly how prestige hierarchies work, but my sense from just looking at lots of cross-cultural and historical variation is, even though you're always going to have prestige hierarchies, they can differ in how steep the hierarchies are. There seems to be lots of sort of variability there. And I do think when you've got really kind of steep hierarchies, that can be very socially corrosive. I mean, certainly when it comes to political dynamics that I'm familiar with in the UK, a lot of the kind of what you might think of as like anti-establishment backlash that you've seen in recent decades has to do with the fact that lots of people felt, I think accurately, kind of looked down upon and talked down to by more prestigious people in society in ways that I think basically explosive. So the less of that there can be, the better. How to engineer that, I've got no idea. But...
Yeah. Okay, Dennis had one more question. Go ahead.
Yes, thanks. To go back to something that was discussed quite a bit ago, this idea of belief systems that are not true, but help a coalition function socially, or help an individual function within a coalition. It sounds to me like this is something of an extension into more of a social or abstract realm of the whole field of ecological anthropology, because starting with Roy Rappaport's book Pigs for the Ancestors some 50 years ago now, I guess. But the idea is that there are cultures and tribes that have very ridiculous, what would appear to us to be very ridiculous belief systems about rituals and things that happen over time, but these systems actually allow them to manage agriculture, to manage resources, to not be overrun with pigs, to harvest the yams at the correct time, to make war when populations are getting out of hand, a whole lot of ecological characteristics that are governed by these belief systems, and it's been demonstrated in many cultures. Is this you see that as being related to what you're working on?
Definitely, yeah, definitely within that kind of tradition. I mean, I do think there's a risk of going too far with those sorts of functionalist explanations, where like everything comes out looking like it's perfectly crafted to achieve social goals. So I think humans being humans, a lot of the stuff we do is just rooted in mistakes and certain kinds of irrationality. But yeah, the idea that belief systems that look superficially irrational from a kind of epistemological point of view, solely focusing on questions of truth, serve these other kind of functions. Yeah, that's exactly the kind of idea that I try to push in my research. And I think it is maybe influential within certain areas of anthropology, but I think we should take that kind of insight and apply it to modern belief systems as well. And often you don't find that to quite the same degree.
How would you describe your method of doing research, since you say?
Really, I would describe it as all over the place. There's no clear methodology that I follow. I mean, I'm much more interested in questions than I am in methodologies or disciplines. So I try to be just very opportunistic in terms of what kinds of findings I draw upon and what kinds of areas and fields that I look into. And I think that has benefits, and I think it also has costs. But I mean, I'm a philosopher in the sense that I don't run experiments. I don't go out there and collect data. And I think I'm interested in relatively big general questions. But in terms of the way in which I try to answer those questions, it's almost never just with a priori armchair reflection, which is what lots of philosophers do.
So would you use something like GSS, general surveys or anything like that, or is that?
Yeah, some survey data, but also things like experimental psychology. I'm never running the experiments, but I think there's lots of interesting research in experimental psychology, and just general observations of human social practices and behavior. That might be in anthropology, that might be in sociology. But yeah, I definitely don't have a well worked out methodology. I tend to just be interested in questions and then try to go about answering them in whatever way seems most appropriate.
Okay. All right, well, I think I'll give people a few more seconds to decide that they want to ask questions. If not, I think I'll close this out. Thank you. I really enjoyed the discussion, and I want to keep in touch. I'll definitely follow your Substack. I'm sure you can find it. Dan Williams Substack if you Google that. And again, what do you call it? Something cognition. What is it?
Conspicuous cognition.
Conspicuous cognition. Okay. And I'll definitely follow that one. And thanks very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for the invitation. Really enjoyed this.
Okay.
Cheers.
Bye.